What happens when one of Hollywood's most beloved comedic actors walks onto a daytime talk show and finds himself in the most uncomfortable conversation of his career? What starts as a routine promotional appearance quickly transforms into something nobody in that studio could have predicted. This is the story of how a simple question spiraled into one of the most intense moments in daytime television history. Before we get into this, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us what you think about what went down here. Trust me, you're going to have opinions. Ben Stiller walked onto the View set with the same energy he always brings. That mix of humor and humility that's made him a household name for decades. The audience gave him the warm reception they always do, and he settled into his seat surrounded by the panel of hosts. What nobody knew, including Ben himself, was that this appearance was about to go completely off the rails. Joy Behar started things off in typical fashion, welcoming him to the show and mentioning his latest project. Ben smiled, thanked her, and began talking about the film he was there to promote. Everything seemed normal. The other hosts chimed in with their usual banter, asking about his process, his co-stars, the challenges of directing and acting simultaneously. Ben was in his element, telling stories, making the audience laugh, doing exactly what he came there to do. Then Joy pivoted. She leaned forward slightly and said she wanted to ask him about something else, something that had been making headlines recently. Ben's expression shifted just slightly, a flicker of caution crossing his face, but he nodded and told her to go ahead. Joy brought up a controversy surrounding some of his older films, specifically the way certain characters were portrayed, and whether he felt those choices would be made differently today. Ben took a breath before responding. He said that he understood the question and that it was something he'd thought about quite a bit over the years. He acknowledged that comedy has evolved, that sensibilities have changed, and that some things that seemed acceptable or funny 20 years ago don't necessarily land the same way now. He said he believed in growth and learning, both personally and as a society, and that he tried to be thoughtful about the work he creates. Joy nodded along but then pressed further. She asked if he was essentially admitting that some of his most famous work was problematic. The word hung in the air for a moment. Ben shifted in his seat, and you could see him choosing his words carefully. He said he wouldn't use that exact word, that context matters, that comedy is about pushing boundaries, and sometimes that means making choices that in retrospect might not have been perfect. But that doesn't mean the intent was ever malicious. That's when Joy's tone changed. She said that intent doesn't always matter when people are hurt by something. She brought up specific examples from his films, moments that had been criticized online, and asked him directly if he could understand why people found them offensive. The energy in the room shifted noticeably. The other hosts exchanged glances. The audience had gone quiet, sensing that this wasn't the light promotional interview they'd expected. Ben took another moment before responding. He said of course he could understand why some people might be offended, that everyone has a right to their feelings about art and entertainment. But then he added that he also believed in the importance of being able to laugh at ourselves, at awkward situations, at the absurdities of life. He said that comedy has always been about finding humor in discomfort, and that if we lose the ability to do that, we lose something important about what makes us human. Joy immediately countered. She said there's a difference between laughing at situations and laughing at people, especially marginalized people. She asked if he really believed his films never crossed that line. Ben's jaw tightened slightly. He said he'd never set out to mock anyone, that his characters were always meant to be fully realized human beings, flaws and all. He said reducing complex comedic performances to whether they pass some modern purity test wasn't fair to the work, or to the audiences who connected with it. The tension was building rapidly now. Another host tried to interject to lighten things up, but Joy wasn't done. She said it wasn't about a purity test, it was about accountability. She asked why it was so hard for him to just say sorry, to acknowledge that maybe some of his choices caused harm. Ben's face was getting red now, and his voice had an edge to it that wasn't there before. He said he'd acknowledged that multiple times already in this very conversation, that he'd said things evolve, and that he's always trying to do better, but that he wasn't going to sit there and flagellate himself for making people laugh. Joy shot back that nobody was asking him to flagellate himself. They were asking him to show some humility. Ben let out a short, incredulous laugh. He said he'd been nothing but humble this entire conversation, that he'd been thoughtful and considered in his responses, but that apparently that wasn't enough. He said it seemed like the only acceptable answer was for him to denounce his entire body of work, and he wasn't going to do that. The audience was completely silent now. You could cut the tension with a knife. One of the other hosts tried again to step in, suggesting they move on to another topic, but Joy ignored her. She told Ben that his defensiveness was proving her point. She said that when people in positions of privilege are confronted with their mistakes, they often react with hostility instead of genuine reflection. That's when Ben stood up slightly in his seat, his voice rising. He said he hadn't been hostile, that he'd been answering her questions honestly and openly, but that this had clearly become an ambush rather than an interview. He said if she wanted to have a real conversation about comedy and culture and how things change over time, he was all for it, but that this wasn't that. This was her trying to score points by backing him into a corner. Joy's eyes flashed. She said she wasn't trying to score points. She was trying to get him to take responsibility. Ben fired back, asking what exactly she wanted him to take responsibility for. For making movies that millions of people loved? For creating characters that resonated with audiences? For having a career built on making people laugh during difficult times? He said he'd spent his entire professional life trying to bring joy to people, and now he was being treated like some kind of villain for it. The other hosts were trying desperately to regain control of the situation now. One of them loudly said they needed to go to commercial, but before they could cut away, Joy got one more shot in. She told Ben that maybe if he'd spent less time worrying about making people laugh and more time worrying about who he was laughing at, they wouldn't be having this conversation. Ben stared at her for a long moment, his chest rising and falling with quick breaths, clearly trying to control his temper. When they came back from commercial, you could feel that something had fundamentally changed. The usual light-hearted atmosphere of The View was gone, replaced by something much heavier. Ben was still in his seat, but his posture was different now, more rigid, more defensive. Joy had that look on her face that regular viewers know well, the one that says she's not backing down no matter what. The host who had called for the commercial tried to steer things in a new direction, asking Ben about his upcoming projects and whether he had any plans to return to directing. But before Ben could even start to answer, Joy cut in. She said she didn't think they were finished with their previous conversation. She told Ben that walking away from difficult conversations was exactly the problem she was talking about. Ben turned to look at her directly and said he wasn't walking away from anything, that they'd gone to commercial, and that maybe it was time to move on to literally anything else. Joy shook her head. She said that's what people with privilege always do. They get uncomfortable, and they want to change the subject. She asked him point blank if he thought his success in Hollywood had anything to do with the fact that he fits a certain mold, that he's part of a system that has historically elevated certain voices while silencing others. Ben's mouth actually fell open slightly at that. He asked her if she was seriously suggesting that his entire career was just handed to him because of who he is. Joy said that's not what she said, but that he couldn't deny that opportunities come easier to some people than others. Ben laughed, but it wasn't a humorous laugh. It was the sound of someone who couldn't believe what they were hearing. He said he'd worked his tail off for everything he'd achieved, that he'd started doing stand-up in tiny clubs, that he'd taken countless small roles before getting his break, that he'd directed his first film on a shoestring budget with nobody believing in it. He said reducing all of that to privilege was insulting not just to him, but to everyone who'd worked alongside him and believed in him along the way. Joy leaned back and said she wasn't trying to insult him, but that maybe his reaction was so strong because deep down he knew there was truth to what she was saying. That comment visibly rattled Ben. His face flushed deeper, and he said that was an incredibly manipulative thing to say, that she was essentially setting up a trap where any denial on his part would be used as evidence against him. He said that wasn't fair and it wasn't honest debate. Another host jumped in, trying to find middle ground. She said that maybe they were both right in different ways, that Ben had clearly worked hard, but that systemic advantages are also real. Ben turned to her and said, of course, systemic advantages are real. He'd never denied that, but that this conversation had stopped being about that a long time ago. He said Joy wasn't interested in a nuanced discussion about the entertainment industry. She wanted to make him into a villain, and he wasn't going to play along. Joy's voice got sharper. She said the only person making him into a villain was himself with his inability to have an honest conversation. She brought up another one of his films, asking if he could understand why casting choices in that particular movie had been controversial. Ben closed his eyes for a moment, clearly trying to maintain his composure. When he opened them, he said he could understand why some people had concerns, that casting is complicated, and that there are always multiple factors at play, including what the story requires. Who's available? What the budget allows? Joy interrupted him. She said those all sounded like excuses. She asked why it was always excuses instead of just admitting that Hollywood has a diversity problem and that he'd been part of perpetuating it. Ben's voice rose again as he said he wasn't making excuses. He was trying to explain the reality of how films get made. He said it's easy to sit in a chair and judge decisions after the fact, but that when you're actually in the process of creating something, you're dealing with 1,000 different variables, and you're trying your best to make good choices. Joy said trying your best isn't good enough when people are harmed by those choices. Ben actually laughed out loud at that, a bitter sound. He said she kept using the word harm like his comedies were actively hurting people, and that he found that absolutely absurd. He said these were movies, entertainment, stories meant to make people laugh and maybe think a little. He said the idea that his work was causing harm was so divorced from reality that he didn't even know how to respond to it. That's when Joy really went after him. She said his dismissiveness was the most revealing thing about this entire conversation. She said the fact that he couldn't even conceive of his work causing harm showed how insulated he was from the real world. She brought up social media posts from people who'd felt mocked or stereotyped by his films, asking if their feelings just didn't matter to him. Ben's hands were gripping the armrests of his chair now. He said of course people's feelings mattered, but that you can't create anything, especially comedy, without someone somewhere taking offense. He said if the standard was that nothing could ever make anyone uncomfortable, then comedy couldn't exist. He said discomfort is part of how comedy works. It's how we process difficult truths and find connection through shared experience of awkwardness and pain. Joy said he was hiding behind the concept of comedy to avoid accountability. She said plenty of comedians manage to be funny without punching down, without relying on stereotypes, without making entire groups of people the butt of the joke. She asked why he seemed so resistant to evolving, to doing better. Ben's voice was shaking now with barely contained frustration. He said he wasn't resistant to evolving, that his work had evolved over the years, that anyone who actually paid attention to his career could see that. He said what he was resistant to was this reductive bad faith interpretation of everything he'd ever done. Another host tried once more to de-escalate, suggesting they were talking past each other and maybe both had valid points. But Joy and Ben were locked in now, neither one willing to back down. Joy said she didn't think they were talking past each other at all. She thought she was being perfectly clear, and that Ben simply didn't like what he was hearing. Ben shot back that she was absolutely right. He didn't like being ambushed and attacked under the guise of an interview. Joy's voice got louder. She said it wasn't an ambush to ask someone about their work and its impact. She said if he couldn't handle basic questions about his career choices, maybe he shouldn't be doing publicity. Ben stood up slightly in his seat again, his face now visibly red with anger. He said these weren't basic questions. They were loaded accusations wrapped in questions, and that she'd had an agenda from the moment he sat down. The other hosts were looking increasingly alarmed. One of them said firmly that they needed to take a breath and reset this conversation. But Joy wasn't done. She asked Ben why he was so angry, why he was raising his voice, why he couldn't just have a calm conversation about important issues. Ben let out an exasperated sound. He said she'd been attacking him for the last 15 minutes, and now she was trying to make him look like the aggressor for responding. He said that was classic manipulation and he wasn't falling for it. Joy said she hadn't attacked anyone. She'd asked legitimate questions. Ben said the way you ask a question can absolutely be an attack, that her tone and framing had been hostile from the start. He said he'd come on the show in good faith, ready to talk about his work and his life, and instead he'd been put on trial for the crime of making comedy films. Joy said if he felt like he was on trial, maybe that said something about his conscience. That comment seemed to push Ben over an edge. He said his conscience was fine, that he'd lived his life trying to be a good person, trying to create things that brought people joy, trying to use his platform for positive purposes. He said he'd made mistakes like every human being does, but that he wasn't going to sit there and be lectured about morality by someone who was clearly more interested in creating conflict than having a real conversation. Joy's eyes narrowed at that last comment. She said if anyone was creating conflict, it was Ben with his defensive attitude and his refusal to engage honestly. She said she'd been nothing but straightforward with him, and that if he couldn't handle straightforward questions, that was his problem, not hers. Ben shook his head slowly, a look of disbelief on his face. He said there was a difference between straightforward and confrontational, and that she'd crossed that line about 10 minutes ago. One of the other hosts, clearly desperate to salvage something from this disaster, tried to ask Ben about his charity work, about the organizations he supports. But Joy spoke right over her. She said she didn't want to talk about his charity work. She wanted to finish the conversation they were having. She turned back to Ben and asked if he'd ever actually listened to the criticism of his work, if he'd ever really sat down and tried to understand why people had problems with some of his films. Ben's voice was tight when he responded. He said of course he'd listened, that he reads what people say, that he thinks about it, that it affects him probably more than she could imagine. He said being in the public eye means constantly being judged, constantly being criticized, and that over the years he'd developed thick skin out of necessity. But he said there's a difference between thoughtful criticism and what was happening right now, which was just an attack disguised as concern for social justice. Joy bristled at that. She said she resented the implication that her concerns weren't genuine, that she was just performing for some reason. She said she'd spent her entire career speaking up for people who didn't have a voice, and that she wasn't going to stop doing that just because it made someone like Ben uncomfortable. Ben said someone like him, asking what exactly she meant by that. Joy said she meant someone who'd benefited from the system and now didn't want to acknowledge it. Ben leaned forward now, his voice low and intense. He said he'd acknowledged it multiple times during this conversation, but that apparently no amount of acknowledgement was enough for her. He said it seemed like she wanted him to grovel, to completely disown his entire body of work, and he wasn't going to do that because he was actually proud of what he'd created. He said his films had meant something to people, had helped people through difficult times, had made people laugh when they needed it most, and that had value even if it didn't fit into her narrow definition of acceptability. Joy said his films had also made people feel othered, made people feel mocked, made people feel like they didn't belong. She asked if he cared about that at all, or if he only cared about the people who liked his work. Ben said of course he cared, but that you can't please everyone, and that art, including comedic art, is inherently subjective. He said what one person finds hilarious, another might find offensive, and that's just the nature of creativity. He said the alternative is to create nothing, to say nothing, to risk nothing, and that's not the kind of artist he ever wanted to be. Joy said he kept framing this as an artistic freedom issue when it was really about basic human decency. She asked how hard it would be for him to just say that he understood some of his choices had been hurtful, and that he was sorry. Ben's voice rose again. He said he'd essentially said that exact thing multiple times already, but that she wasn't listening because she'd already decided he was the villain in her narrative. He said this wasn't a conversation, it was a performance where she got to be the righteous crusader, and he was supposed to play the role of the chastened celebrity. Another host finally managed to get a word in, saying that maybe everyone was getting a bit too heated and they should take a moment. But the damage was done. The floodgates were open, and both Ben and Joy seemed determined to have this out completely. Joy said she wasn't performing anything, that this was real and important, and that Ben's dismissiveness was exactly the problem with Hollywood culture. She said powerful people protect each other, they excuse each other's mistakes, and they attack anyone who tries to hold them accountable. Ben actually laughed at that, a sharp, bitter sound. He said he wasn't powerful, he was just a guy who made movies. He said the idea that he was part of some grand conspiracy to protect bad behavior was absurd. He said he'd always tried to be ethical, always tried to treat people well, always tried to use his platform responsibly. He said reducing him to some cartoon villain was not only unfair, it was inaccurate. Joy said she wasn't reducing him to anything. She was judging him by his own work and his own words. She brought up a specific scene from one of his most famous films, describing it in detail and asking him to defend it. Ben closed his eyes and took a deep breath. When he opened them, he said he wasn't going to defend individual scenes out of context from movies made decades ago. He said comedy is about the totality of a piece, about the journey characters go on, about what's ultimately being said. He said pulling out one moment and demanding he justify it was intellectually dishonest. Joy said what was intellectually dishonest was his refusal to engage with legitimate criticism. She said he was hiding behind complexity and context to avoid admitting that sometimes he'd made choices that reinforced harmful stereotypes. Ben's hands were trembling slightly now. He said he'd made thousands of choices over his career. And yes, with the benefit of hindsight, some of them probably could have been different. But he said that's true of literally every artist who's ever created anything. He said growth requires making mistakes, learning from them, and doing better, which is exactly what he'd tried to do. Joy pounced on that. She said so he was admitting he'd made mistakes. Ben said of course he'd made mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. That's part of being human. Joy said then why had it taken this entire conversation to get him to say that? Ben's voice cracked slightly with frustration, as he said he'd been saying versions of that from the beginning, but that she kept twisting his words, kept demanding more and more contrition, kept moving the goalposts of what would be an acceptable response. The audience was completely transfixed now, watching this train wreck unfold in real time. Another host tried to interject with a lighter question, something about Ben's process or his co-stars, anything to break the tension. But both Ben and Joy ignored her completely. They were locked in their battle, neither willing to give an inch. Joy said she hadn't twisted anything, that she'd simply been asking him to take responsibility. Ben said he'd taken responsibility, but that responsibility didn't mean accepting her version of events or her interpretation of his work. Joy asked what his interpretation was then. She asked him to explain to her and to the audience how they should view his films, how they should understand the choices he'd made. Ben said he couldn't tell people how to view his work, that art doesn't work that way. He said everyone brings their own experiences, their own perspectives, their own sensitivities to what they watch. He said some people would find his films hilarious and meaningful, others would find them problematic, and both responses could be valid simultaneously. Joy said that was a cop-out. She said he couldn't just throw his hands up and say it's all subjective when real people were affected by his choices. Ben's composure was cracking further now. He said he'd never thrown his hands up about anything, that he'd been engaging with her questions as honestly and thoughtfully as he could under incredibly hostile circumstances. He said the problem wasn't that he wouldn't take responsibility. The problem was that nothing he said would ever be enough for her because she'd already decided who he was. Joy said she'd decided who he was based on his own actions and his own words. She said if he didn't like the picture that painted, maybe he should think about why that was. Ben said the picture she was painting was a caricature, a distortion designed to make him look as bad as possible. He said she'd taken a career spanning decades and reduced it to a handful of controversial moments, ignoring all the context, all the positive impact, all the growth and evolution. Joy said she was focusing on the controversial moments because those were the ones that mattered, the ones that hurt people. Ben said everything mattered, that you can't just cherry-pick the moments that support your argument and ignore everything else. He said that's not honest criticism, that's character assassination. Joy's voice got very cold then. She said if he felt like his character was being assassinated, maybe he should look at his own character instead of blaming her for pointing out problems. Ben stood up at that comment. Not fully, but enough that it was clear he was done sitting passively through this. His voice was shaking with emotion when he spoke. He said his character was fine, that he knew who he was and what he stood for, and that he didn't need validation from someone who'd spent the last 20 minutes trying to tear him down. He said he'd come on this show as a guest, with respect for the platform and the audience, and he'd been treated like a criminal from almost the moment he sat down. Joy stood up too now, matching his energy. She said if he felt like a criminal, that was his guilt talking, not her. She said all she'd done was ask questions that any journalist should ask. Questions about impact and responsibility and whether he'd learned anything from the criticism his work had received. Ben said those weren't questions, they were accusations, and that there was a fundamental difference. He said a real question leaves room for an actual answer, but every question she'd asked had been designed to trap him, to make him look bad no matter what he said. The other hosts were standing now too, trying to physically get between them, trying to calm the situation down. One of them said they really needed to go to commercial, that this had gone too far. But Joy pushed past her colleague, keeping her focus on Ben. She told him that if he couldn't handle tough questions, he shouldn't be in the public eye. She said celebrities want all the benefits of fame without any of the accountability, and that she was tired of watching it happen. Ben's face was completely flushed now, his voice loud enough that it was almost echoing in the studio. He said he'd spent his entire career being accountable, being present, engaging with fans and critics alike. He said he'd never hidden from criticism, never refused to discuss his work, never pretended to be perfect. But he said what was happening here wasn't accountability. It was a public shaming designed to boost ratings and make Joy look like some kind of fearless truth-teller. Joy stepped closer, her own voice rising to match his volume. She said she didn't need to boost ratings by attacking him, that The View was perfectly successful without manufactured drama. She said this was real, that her concerns were genuine, and that his inability to see that proved everything she'd been saying about his blind spots. Ben said his only blind spot was apparently thinking he could come on this show and have a reasonable conversation. Another host grabbed Joy's arm, trying to pull her back, while another moved toward Ben, trying to create some physical distance between them. The audience was gasping now. Some people looked shocked, others looked uncomfortable. The energy in the studio had gone from tense to genuinely concerning. This was no longer just a heated debate. This was two people who genuinely could not stand each other in that moment. Joy pulled her arm free and pointed at Ben. She told him that his attitude right now was proving every single point she'd made. She said his anger, his defensiveness, his victimhood, all of it showed that he'd never really thought about anyone but himself. Ben's laugh was sharp and bitter. He said she'd spent this entire conversation generalizing and stereotyping him, which was ironic given what she'd accused him of. Joy said it wasn't the same thing at all, that calling out patterns of behavior wasn't stereotyping. Ben said she'd decided who he was based on preconceived notions, and then bent every answer he gave to fit that narrative. He said she'd asked questions not to learn or understand, but to confirm what she'd already decided was true. Joy said she'd learned plenty from this conversation, mainly that he was exactly who she thought he was. That seemed to be the final straw for Ben. He pulled off his microphone, the sound of it hitting the table sharp in the tense silence. He said he was done, that this wasn't worth it, that he'd tried to engage in good faith and it had been thrown back in his face. He told Joy that she should be ashamed of herself for ambushing a guest like this, for turning what should have been a promotional interview into a personal attack. Joy pulled off her own microphone. She said the only person who should be ashamed was him, for wasting decades of privilege and platform and learning nothing. She said she'd given him every opportunity to show some growth, some awareness, some humility, and he'd responded with nothing but ego and defensiveness. Ben was moving toward the edge of the set now, clearly ready to leave. But he turned back for one more exchange. He told Joy that she didn't know him, that this conversation didn't define him, and that he felt sorry for her if she really believed the reductive version of him she'd created in her head. He said real people are complicated, that real art is complicated, and that her black and white view of the world was ultimately just sad. Joy moved to the edge of the set too, unwilling to let him have the last word. She said she didn't need to know him personally to judge his public work and his public statements. She said that's what being a public figure meant, that your work spoke for itself. She told him that if he didn't like being judged by his work, he should make better work. Ben said his work was great, that millions of people had connected with it, and that the opinion of one talk show host with an axe to grind didn't change that. Joy said she didn't have an axe to grind, she had standards. Ben said her standards were impossible, that they required perfection and the ability to know how every joke would land with every person for all time. He said holding people to impossible standards just meant you got to feel superior while never creating anything yourself. That hit a nerve. Joy's voice got even louder as she said she didn't need lectures from him about anything. Ben said he wasn't lecturing. He was defending himself against bad faith criticism. He said there was a difference between holding someone accountable and trying to destroy someone's reputation on live television. Joy said if his reputation was destroyed, he'd destroyed it himself with his answers and his attitude. Ben said she'd shown the world who she really was, someone more interested in conflict than conversation. He said her approach to dialogue was toxic and made it impossible to have real discussions about difficult topics. The host who'd been trying to moderate finally stepped fully between them, her voice firm as she said this needed to stop right now. Ben nodded curtly and started walking off the set. But Joy called after him, telling him he could run away, but the questions would still be there. Ben stopped at the edge of the set and turned back one final time. He said he wasn't running from anything, that he'd faced her questions head-on. He said the problem wasn't the questions, it was that she'd never had any intention of listening to his answers. He said this had been a setup from the start, and that he regretted giving her the satisfaction of losing his cool. He said in the future he'd be more careful about which shows he chose to appear on. And with that, Ben Stiller walked off the View set, leaving behind a stunned audience, shocked co-hosts, and one very fired-up Joy Behar. The remaining hosts scrambled to wrap up the segment, promising viewers they'd be right back. But everyone watching knew that what had just happened would be the only thing anyone talked about for days. So what do you think? Did Ben have a right to be upset? Or was he being too defensive? Was Joy out of line with her questioning? Or was she just doing her job? Drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts. And make sure you hit that subscribe button because we'll be breaking down the fallout from this interview as more information comes out. This story is far from over.